Welcome to the BOGART Effect, a wealthy wisdom podcast. The following BOGART Effect podcast is intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from BOGART or another investment professional. Please see important disclosure information at the end of the presentation. All right. Good morning and welcome to the BOGART Effect. I'm James Bogart. I've got Victoria with me. And today we're going to be talking about college planning. So Victoria, thanks for taking some time this morning.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
You know, college planning is something that we talk a lot about with our clients and different facets. Sometimes it's for their children. Sometimes it's for their grandchildren. You know, and it's one of these areas where there's a lot of things to cover. And so, you know, we're going to do our best today to kind of wrap everything around it. But, you know, at a high level, I would say that, you know, there's approximately 7 to 8 million families that have 7 to 8 million families that have school-age children, right? So this is a conversation around not only how do we pay for it once it happens, but how do we get ready for it before it happens, right?
Exactly.
So, Victoria, what would you say are the top 5 questions that a lot of our clients are asking us around college planning?
Yeah. So the top 5 questions around college planning that a lot of people have are cost of college is one of them. How should they pay and save for college is another. Then people want to know what kind of financial aid or scholarships are available to them that will help them not only pay for college, but also help them pay for the college that their kid wants to go to. And then it comes around choosing the right kind of college, you know, location, financially, is it the best fit? Does it have the right program my kid wants to attend to? And then finally, the big question is, how do we minimize student debt? That's, I think, is a very big question that even now, a lot of people who even have graduated college are still trying to figure out.
Yep. So probably best to start with the cost of college. Yeah, and this is one where I think a lot of people just assume, you know, cost of college is tuition and maybe room and board. But the fact is there's a lot more cost that goes into college than just tuition, room, and board.
Yes.
You need meal plans, you need books, and then you need transportation to and from college. You need potentially to have some spending money and things to live off of. Or if you want to do any kind of extracurriculars. I was in a fraternity when I was in college, and that's an example of something that it gets expensive when you factor in dues and trips that you guys might be doing together, things of that sort, right?
Yeah.
And so part of it is budgeting for it, or I would say setting the expectation precedent with your child or grandchild around how those types of things are going to get funded. And we're going to get into some of that in a few minutes. But the point is college cost is not just the cost of the college. There's a lot of other things that go into it. So let's talk a little bit about what are the costs, Victoria, for public universities, out-of-state universities, private universities, et cetera?
So basically, in-state public universities, total cost averages about $30,000. And then out-of-state and private universities is double that, so around $60,000 per year.
Well, and actually, some of the private universities are Vanderbilt was the first to break $100,000 a year. So some of the private ones are even more expensive than the out-of-state tuitions of the publics.
Exactly. So for students, it's, I think, trying to gauge basically what is not only affordable, but also thinking about where they see the return on investment. Because at the end of the day, a 4-year degree is more or less a 4-year degree.
No, you're and candidly, dependent upon pathway, that might not be the only level of education that you're needing to go down, right? If you're going to go to law school, if you're going to go to become a doctor, as an example, it's not uncommon that you're going to have additional educational requirements post finishing up the undergraduate, and dependent upon the career path, I would argue what college you go to for graduate work is actually more important than what college you go to for the undergraduate work,
Yeah.
right? So some of it's a little bit of a mapping exercise as you kind of begin the journey. And I would tell you from my experience, even personally, I didn't really know what my career path was going to be going into college. And I would say that most of the children of our clients or grandchildren of our clients, as they go to college, they don't necessarily have that pathway or know what pathway they're going to go down. And it's extremely common that it changes.
Yeah.
And majors, minors change throughout the time that you're in undergraduate. And I'd actually encourage that. I just think it's healthy, for cognitive reasons and everything else. But the thing that's baffling though is the cost of college has just been something that is dramatically outpaced inflation.
Yes,
I mean, just
exactly.
dramatically, 93.2% over the last 20 years. I mean, and if you look at that on an annualized basis, it's almost 2 to 3% more per year on the rising cost of college. So, when we talk about like, how do we project this? What are we using in terms of tools, Victoria?
So in terms of tools, we typically use planning software. I love to use personally a calculation that's called time value money. In this calculation, it's basically a 3-step calculation to first, what is the current cost of college? Then you calculate the projection of what it's going to be in, let's say, 18 years for when your kid is about to go to college. And we factor in inflation on that. So the recent 5-year average is about 3.08% for college costs. Once you project the future costs, then you kind of figure out, okay, as it is increasing while my kid is attending college over time, over let's say 4 years, how much is that going to cost me overall? Is basically how we calculate that.
Yeah, and then depending upon the age of your so now let's talk about how we save for this stuff, right?
Yes.
I'm already getting ahead of myself, but then you start looking at what is the age of my child now, and we discount that future cost back to whatever that age is, right? So, for example, when my son was born, it was an 18-year exercise, right? Like I'm anticipating that he's going to go to college when he turns 18 years old, right? So. Same calculation you just mentioned, take the 4 years, aggregate them, discount it back to today, and boom, I've got the number that I need to fund. Now, that's a lump sum number, right? Where I could just say, all right, at this point, I'm going to write a check and that'll cover college. The reality is no one does that. I mean, myself included. We do not do that. You then look at what do I need to be saving on a monthly or annual basis to achieve the objective, right? And I think it's really healthy as you're building those savings models to look at in-state tuition, out-of-state public tuition, as well as private. And then when we talk about the vehicles that are available to us to save, most people, even with advanced planning, most people end up still covering most of college tuition out of cash flow.
Yes.
Or they're using after-tax assets. I think in your prep, you said 74% of college funding comes from families' income.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
And so, it's one of those where, and that only covers usually half of the expense, 49% of the actual expense. But, the financial planner and us would be remiss if we didn't talk about what are the vehicles that we could use to get ahead of this cost so it's not such a heavy burden when your child actually leaves and goes to college, right? And the number one vehicle I would tell you is a 529 plan.
Yes.
These are college savings vehicles where you can put money in, and as long as the money comes out for qualified education expenses, all of the growth that you've materialized over the years is completely tax-free. And again, emphasis is on qualified education expenses. So talk to me a little bit about how much you can put into 529s.
So there's actually no limit when it comes to a 529 contribution. You can put as much as you want or as little as you want. I think a rule of thumb that we kind of do for our clients, especially when they're preparing their kids for college and saving for college, is we kind of do a simulation where they fund 50 to 70% of the actual college costs. because, and we'll get to this a little later, is we count in, a lot of people, they'll get basically financial aid, scholarships, grants. So we kind of leave a buffer for that. And we also want to make sure we don't really overfund these saving vehicles, because it's a lot harder to kind of get the money out when you've already paid all of your educational costs. But the cool thing about the 529 is there is something where you can do basically a front load. We mostly use it for grandparents who own 529s. They basically can contribute up to 5 years of the current max of the annual gifting limit. So this year it's $19,000. If you're a single grandparent, that's I think 19 times 5.
95.
Yes, thank you.
95,000.
95.
95, and if you're married, you can double it, so you could put 190,000 in.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'll admit, I think I can count on one hand in my 19-year career how many times that's actually been done.
Mm-hmm. It's very rare.
Most grandparents are still doing like an annual number, and it adds up pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
But this becomes a question of where are your assets? Like if you have big after-tax monies that are you're paying income, you're paying capital gains on along the way. Whereas if it's saved in a 529, same time horizon, and assuming it's the same investment thesis, the reality of it is if it's in a 529, it's growing completely tax-free for the same intention of qualified education expenses.
Exactly.
So it's a little bit of what I would describe as an optimization exercise.
And the cool thing about the 529 is it's also accessible to pay for like trade school.
Yeah, and the other thing I would emphasize, because I want to pull on your comment about we don't want to overfund these, you can always change the beneficiary as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So, it's one of these perpetuated conversations where we can change it to, like if grandpa and grandma are setting it up, we can change it to be another one of the grandchildren if one of the grandchildren decides not to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
We also now, these are actually some new provisions. We can use the 529 to pay for K through 12 starting in 2026. It's actually $20,000 a year. So if you have children or grandchildren that are in private schools, this is a vehicle, again, also, tax-free growth on the assets up to those distribution thresholds, which is nice. And the other new, this is actually Secure Act of 2020, but the other new provision is that you can actually now, as long as the 529 has been in existence for 15 years, use up to $35,000 of the remnant balance to fund a Roth IRA for your children or grandchildren as well, whoever the beneficiary is.
Exactly.
So, it's one of these things where the overfunding is becoming less and less of a risk.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree. We're not trying to dramatically outsize the savings into these vehicles. However, it is nice when, we have some flexibility, if you will, to use for earlier expenses, or even use if there is a remnant amount that we're not using for postgraduate or some other type of legacy work. And then to build on that, like if you happen to be in the position where you want to start thinking about saving for your grandchildren, your great grandchildren, right? Like you actually can change the beneficiary to make it the next generation as well.
Exactly.
So, these are all tools that we can use in relation to the 529s. Now, there are other types of accounts, right, Victoria?
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the other types of accounts that we can use for savings for college vehicles?
Yeah. So there is a really cool account called the Coverdell Education Savings Account. This one has a little bit more of, guidelines or rules. You can only contribute about $2,000 per year per student. So there's a little bit of limitations on contributions. However, on the upside, you have a lot more investment options with a Coverdell than you do with a 529. A 529, I kind of like to say the investment options are very similar to like a 401k. You have a target fund. You have, different funds for large cap growth, your typical mid cap, small cap, international. But with a Coverdell, you can invest in stocks.
Yep. Or ETFs, mutual funds.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
The negative with Coverdells is there are income phase outs.
Exactly.
So depending upon how much money you make, you might not be able to do Coverdells. I believe it's $95,000 if you're single, and $190,000 if you're married.
Exactly.
Right. So again, that's one where appropriateness is going to be dictated off of what is your household income level. The other one that we talk a lot about is custodial accounts, and this is just minor accounts. They'd be after taxes. There's not going to be any of the restrictions on investments. There's not any gifting exemption limits or anything of the sort. They do not get the benefit of that lump sum option that you mentioned, the 5 times of the annual contribution limit. But you theoretically can gift to a grandchild, whatever the number is, and put it into an account that's in a custodial account that their legal guardian, parents usually, are sitting on top of. The problem I see with custodial accounts is they're subject to what's called kiddie tax.
Yep.
Which means that up until the age of 25, the owner of that account would be subject to whatever the parents' tax rates are or kiddie tax laws that apply. We have presentations solely dictated to kiddie tax, so I don't need to get into that. But when we're talking about the savings for college, this is an area where I would say, especially when you're in the accumulation mode of life, every marginal dollar is getting chipped away at. Save for college, save for retirement, save for a house, save for a car, save for, and so this is where it becomes a prioritization exercise. And I think coming back to your early comment, Victoria, I like the idea of making it intentional, but not necessarily feeling like you have to fully fund here. This advanced savings conversation is one to help alleviate the burden in the future, so that by the way, with not saving it, we just know our decision is that we're either going to use loans or we're going to pay out of cash flow 18 years from now or whatever it is that your kid goes to college. But that could be financially very onerous all at once.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do here is help alleviate some of that burden in the future by doing some savings now. And this is where I don't necessarily, when I'm having a conversation with a client, tell them, hey, you need to fully fund this, right? Like, what is the amount on a monthly basis or annual basis that you can afford to put into a 529 that is comfortable without jeopardizing your quality of life or other things related to it? Just knowing that if paying for college is something that's very important to you, that this is a conversation we need to be having now.
Exactly.
Now, if you're a grandparent and you're wanting to alleviate the burden for your kids, that's very generous of you, knowing that that's obviously part of a bigger legacy conversation. I would highly encourage grandparents, though, to have a conversation with their kids. And why I say that is because I want to make sure that you're not coming back to the overfunding, right? But I want to make sure that we're not, doubling up or excessively funding any of these 529s, because kids don't know that what grandpa and grandma are doing, right? And vice versa, right? So it's a great mechanism to use to start opening up communication lines so that everybody's on the same page. Now, you don't have to disclose any of the other assets or anything else you have, right? It's just you're wanting to contribute to 529s. That said, if grandpa and grandma are doing it, I highly recommend grandpa and grandma do it in their name. For the beneficiary of their grandchild, simply because we're going to get into FAFSA next. It's probably a perfect segue.
Yeah.
But in terms of qualification for some of the government income-based programs, 529s count towards that math. So if grandpa and grandma are doing savings for grandchildren, I really do want grandpa and grandma to be the owners of the 529s with their grandchildren as the beneficiaries, and then have their children as the successor owners, right? So the grandchild's parents as the successor owners. And the reason really does come into it's a larger, let's just say, family web, where the grandparents can change the beneficiaries to a larger number of people, but also more importantly around qualification for government subsidies or income-based need programs. So let's get into that. I know we're kind of jumping in, but government aid is something that I think, again, we talk about the cost of college and how expensive it is now. If there's programs, how do we go about finding them? And then let's drill into some of those, Victoria.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people often forget that there's a lot of, different programs under government aid. And the best way to find it is the FAFSA. Now, only 21% of families know that the FAFSA actually opens in October. So it's good to check the website every year as October approaches. Basically, what happens is the student goes on there, they create their account. They list up to 20 colleges that they're interested in attending. And then the FAFSA, basically you input the data of the parents' assets, anything the student might own. So like a custodial account actually is included under the student. And once that's there, they calculate basically based on the assets of the family and how much each college on that list is going to cost. And then basically what happens is they calculate what's called the student aid index. It's based off of the assets, family size, number of kids going to college within that family. And the lower the SAI number is, the more college financial aid that you need is what that is the way that works. So after that's calculated, what basically happens is colleges that you've listed on your list will go there, figure out, okay, this student has this SAI index number. How can we calculate and figure out how much financial aid we can provide them? They'll set up a combination. Usually it's grants, student loans, both subsidized and unsubsidized, and any additional scholarships that within the college that they are eligible for. And then once that's all prepared, the student basically can go online through the portal and figure out, okay, I've been accepted at this college. They're offering me this financial aid package. Compare and contrast among the different colleges they've listed and see which one is the best option for them.
From a cost perspective,
Yes.
Victoria, I give you credit. That's one of the best explanations of FAFSA I've seen in a while.
Thank you.
And the one thing I will say is, no matter what, even if you have assets and you have income, I highly recommend go through the process of filling out the FAFSA form. Mm-hmm. You never know, honestly.
Exactly.
If there's qualifications there, dependent upon the school that you're in, and I think that it's a little bit of brain damage. Really, it's a lot of data that you have to pull in and go through. But at the same time, too, it's absolutely worth it, in my opinion, just to see what's out there.
Yeah, and recently the FAFSA actually has narrowed down their questions to, I think, around 20. So when I took it, or when I applied for the FAFSA, it was a lengthy couple-day process. It's definitely been shortened, which is nice. It's not as overbearing. So it's definitely doable.
So am I understanding this correctly? You did it? Your parents didn't do it?
I did it for the most part. And then if I didn't know something, I would ask them a question.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the tools I really like is empowering your student or grandchild to find money, right? So one of the ones that I've seen that I just think is the most creative is, if you get a grant, if you get a scholarship, that's your money, right? Use that for all the other stuff that goes outside of the tuition, right? We talked about the fraternity, sororities, the swag, et cetera. That's money that's available for the living expenses, because it empowers them to find a way of having some extra discretionary cash to cover some of the expenses associated with college.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. Outside of government related stuff, you mentioned the subsidized, non-subsidized. I think this is an area where, as your student is preparing for college, leverage the resources that their high schools have. This is counselors, student aid, tutors. There's always a financial aid program within the universities that they're applying to. Those are all resources that aren't going to cost any money, that are fantastic to leverage, and they can help with kind of pathwaying this conversation as well. Anything else you want to add on that, Victoria?
I strongly recommend students utilizing their guidance counselors at their high school. That, to me, from personal experience, is the number one source to find scholarships within the community. Now, I come from a small town, population of 9,000, but my school the community actually had a really big scholarship program where You would apply, and it's kind of similar to what is called, I guess, scholarships.com for like the general broad world of scholarships. But for my community is you applied once, you did an interview, and there was probably like over 100 scholarships that, they would filter out through that application to see which ones the student was eligible for. So I highly recommend starting, if you don't know where to start with your guidance counselor at your high school.
Yeah, and related to that, there are so many nuances and scholarships or grant programs that aren't even necessarily known about. Like, this is why I love the idea of empowering your student to go find them. I ended up getting an academic scholarship. I had actually got a couple $1,000s of academic scholarship when I was in college. One was related to business school. One was related to volunteer work that I had done. One was related to the Boy Scouts. I mean, so I was able to find different scholarships. Really, again, it started with leveraging resources from my high school, but also the resources that were available at the university once I got there. Let's talk a little bit about choosing the right college. I think that it goes without saying there are a lot of options out there, from in-state to out-of-state, liberal arts, business related, and we talked a little bit about earlier on, but I believe that more often than not, people don't necessarily know, students don't know their pathway when they first go to college, and they're probably going to change their pathway along the way. Talk a little bit about what goes into selecting a college, Victoria.
So selecting a college, everyone's experience is different. Let me just start off with that. Most students will probably start off with the most popular in-state university because, it's right there. It's accessible.
And it's what all their friends are doing.
Yeah. And there's a strong likelihood that you're going to get into that college. Other ones to consider is the program. Okay. If you have an interest, let's say economics or robotics, find the school that has a strong program of that interest. And then you also want to consider the location, because I think location can be a toss-up depending on the person, the student, and the family. The farther the college, you have a lot of downsides. Like, you won't be able to see your family as often. Don't forget about the travel costs it takes for when you come home for break or when you have to go back to college.
No, that's a fantastic point. I think the underlying theme, though, that you and I both have emphasized here is don't let the cost be the sole decision, right?
Exactly.
There's a lot of other factors that go into it. The programs, the location, the type of atmosphere. Like, for example, you might really want to have, my wife is in this category. She regrets not having a football team at the college she went to, right? She went to a great college, right? But
exactly.
And so that's something when you talk about what that experience looks like, some people could care less if there's a football team, right? And those are things that come into the decisions that need to be factored in. Before we get too long, I want to make sure we spend a couple minutes talking about student loans.
Oh, yes.
Because as we've talked about, most people will self-fund these. There's intentionality around this conversation. If you're not having any level of thinking about it early on, then naturally we start to face the consequences, if you will, because you're then going to either fund it out of cash flow, out of savings that you have, or we're going to have to take on loans. And there's lots and lots and lots of different types of loans. There's government subsidized loans, Stafford loans. There's private loans that are a little bit more expensive. And as we talk about the cost of college and how much this is a financial commitment, it's one of those things where I want to be very cognizant of the fact that this is an economic decision that has consequences. So I know I just said, don't let the cost be the driver, but at the same time too, recognizing this is the first, let's just say, adult conversation that a student will have around the consequences of the decision that they're making.
Exactly.
Because dependent upon how prepared someone is for that college conversation, they might not have the flexibility, right? Like, they might not have grandpa and grandma who are helping offset the cost of a private education. And as we mentioned, like, if you go to school like George Washington, Vanderbilt, that's $100,000 a year just for tuition, not factoring in all the other stuff, right? So now you're talking all in close to $500,000 for your education. Like, is there enough value created off of that decision And then recognizing that there are financial implications to that. How are we going to pay for this stuff? And so if that's something that needs to be factored in, understand how that needs to sequence into what does my starting salary need to be post graduation to offset the cost of the student loans. And again, these are adult conversations that I think are really, really, really important to be had. Victoria, thank you so much. This was a great presentation on college planning. Looking forward to having you back for future ones.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
The previous presentation by Bogart Wealth was intended for general information purposes only. No portion of the presentation serves as the receipt of or as a substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart Wealth or any other investment professional of your choosing. Different types of investments involve varying degrees of risk, and it should not be assumed that future performance of any specific investment or investment strategy or any other non-investment related or planning services, discussion, or content will be profitable, be suitable for your portfolio or individual situation, or prove successful. Neither Bogart Wealth's investment advisor registration status nor any amount of prior experience or success should be construed that a certain level of results or satisfaction will be achieved if Bogart Wealth is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. Bogart Wealth is neither a law firm nor accounting firm, and no portion of its services shall be construed as legal or accounting advice. No portion of the podcast content should be construed by a client or prospective client as a guarantee that he or she will experience a certain level of results if Bogart Wealth is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. Copies of Bogart Wealth's current written disclosure brochure and Form CRS discussing our advisory services and fees are available upon request or at www.bogartwealth.com.